Ladies and gentlemen, well, welcome to the 15th Biennial Stephen Roskill Memorial Lecture. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alan Packwood. I'm lucky enough to be the director of the Archive Centre. My task this evening is a very simple, straightforward one. It's to remind you to turn off your mobile phones at this point, or at least to put them onto silent. It's to point out the fire exits, which are at the front and back of the hall. It's to remind you that tonight's proceedings are being recorded and will in due course appear on the new Churchill College website. So if you don't want to appear, then I'm afraid you won't be able to ask a question. My other duty is to introduce our introducer. Now, many of you here will know that our master, Professor Sir David Wallace, is going to be leaving us in a few months' time. This is his last Roskill lecture as master, though we sincerely hope not his last Roskill lecture. Over the next few weeks, of course, there are going to be many occasions to pay tribute to David and to what he's achieved here. But, of course, the platform of the Roskill and the fact that it occurs at this time of year allows me to get in first and to thank him for the phenomenal support that he's given to the Archive Centre during his time here. David.
Alan, thank you very much indeed for these very kind comments. I must say that engaging with the Archives Centre is truly an unalloyed pleasure because of the quality of the work that Alan and his team do in the Centre, both in conserving these treasures which they have and in making them available to the wider world. The Roskill Lecture is a wonderful and unique feature of Churchill College life. It commemorates the life of Captain Stephen Roskill, a man of action, who swapped his life at sea for a life in academia and who served as a life fellow here at Churchill until his death in 1982. Stephen was and is a celebrated naval historian, and he was also one of the founding fathers of our Churchill Archive Centre, which Alan is the current director. And it's therefore very fitting that the Centre organises this biennial lecture in his name. It's a proud tradition that was started by Bill Barnett, who was the first keeper of the archives in 1985, and I'm delighted to see that Bill and Ruth are here with us tonight for the 15th lecture. Welcome to you both, especially. Now, the Roskill Lecture has a serious purpose, and I'll say more about that in a moment, but it's also a great opportunity for us to engage with some of our friends. Indeed, everyone here is invited to a reception in the Archive Centre immediately after the lecture in the Jock Colville Hall. It's always, on occasions like this, a special pleasure to welcome back members of the Roskill family. And I'm truly glad we have several generations here today, ably led by Stephen's eldest son, Nicholas. On the lectures themselves, they have ranged around the globe and have covered a wealth of subjects delivered by a very impressive array of experts. If you look back through the list now, you can see that they document the major concerns that we have had in issues of their time. Lord Carrington, then Secretary-General of NATO, talking about East-West relations in 1985, through Bridget Kendall, and Bridget was going to be here tonight, but you can imagine that events in Ukraine have detained her elsewhere. Bridget was explaining the enigma of Russia in 2003. Prince Hassan discussing the Middle East in 2005. Lord May warning of climate change in 2007. For tonight's lecture, there can be little doubt that the growth and role of China is a major issue today for all thinkers and policymakers, whether from the East or from the West. Few people can have thought or written more about it than tonight's speaker. Jonathan Fenby combines a passion for history in the Churchill era, having written books on de Gaulle and on Yalta, for example, with a career in journalism. Writing books and a career in journalism, that's kind of Churchillian, isn't it? He's been the editor of Reuters, chief correspondent for The Economist, home editor for The Independent, deputy editor of The Guardian, editor of The Observer, then editor of the South China Morning Post. He's currently managing director of the China team at the consultancy firm Trusted Services. Jonathan's lived and worked in Paris and Bonn, but his time in Hong Kong and China has clearly had an enormous impact, and it's led to several books: The 70 Wonders of China, The Imperial Dynasties of China, Dealing with the Dragon, History of Modern China, Tiger Head, Snake Tales. Now, most pertinently for us, and I'm very pleased to say, actually, that I was corrected by Jonathan before the lecture because I learned from Amazon that his new book was going to come out on 28th of March. In fact, it's next week, and it's going to be with the title, Will China Dominate the 21st Century? Well, tonight, we are truly, truly privileged because we're going to get not only a preview of that, but the answer. Jonathan, please come and give your lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Master, for those kind words. You can see I've given away the story before I start, so perhaps we can all go off to the reception since you've got the answer. I've indeed, as Master said, been following China since 1995 when I went to Hong Kong to edit the South China Morning Post, and it has been a fascinating voyage which is likely to continue. I'm extremely honoured to have been invited to give this lecture tonight. My past involvement with the archives at Churchill College included going to the archives with Alan's help for a book I wrote about how Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin managed the alliance during the Second World War, and also with the de Gaulle book, but also with another short book I wrote about the worst ever British single-ship maritime disaster, a ship called the Lancastria that was dive-bombed and sank, a troop ship off France in June 1940, with probably 4,000 people killed that afternoon. And I indeed consulted the Roskill history of the Navy in the Second World War. I'm afraid to say he only thought it was worth half a sentence. He passed on to other things. It wasn't a very grand affair, this. But I looked in the archives too, because Churchill, when the news arrived in London, it was the day that France had surrendered, Italy had come into the war formally, and Churchill wrote, I decided the newspapers had had quite enough bad news for tomorrow. So he slapped a D notice, censorship, on the story, which was not written about. And when my book, The Sinking of the Lancaster, came out about 5 years ago, somebody pointed out to me that the D notice was still pertinent and that I risked going to jail. But nothing ever happened. So, thank you very much for coming through the rain and being here tonight. The sheer scale and speed of China's rise over the last 35 years have induced a feeling of shock and awe around the world. Never before have more people been made materially well off, lifted out of poverty in a shorter space of time in human history. Never before has a developing country, and China still is a developing country, never has it become, for instance, the banker to the world's richest country, which it has been to the United States through the buying of treasury bonds and the funding of the federal deficit. Never has such a huge rising exporting power been so dependent on imports of raw materials. As the saying goes, China is people rich but resources poor, and those resources include the vital one of water, which is running very short in northern China and which we'll come to in a moment. At the same time, China is the last major state on earth ruled by a communist party. You may well say, as I would, that the ism that describes China best today is not Marxism or communism or Confucianism, but materialism. But still, the Communist Party is in monopoly control of China. And although China doesn't have elections, this makes the politics at the top in China very important, and what I spend a lot of my time doing, both in books and at our research service, Trusted Sources, is to try to analyse the way that policy is going. And that leads me to the conclusion comes to the subject of tonight's lecture, that China is not going to dominate the world. Of course, its rise, as I say, has induced a great deal of feeling of that China has somehow found a special secret which is not available to the messy democracies of the West. We've had people ranging from George Soros to Francis Fukuyama saying that China has discovered a better way of running itself and its system than the deficient democracies. The Oxford, now Harvard historian Neil Ferguson has argued that the 21st century belongs to China, and the title of a book that came out a few years ago said it all from that camp, When China Rules the World, although the author now says you shouldn't take the title too seriously. On the other side, there have been the detractors of China. This began back in a book in 2001 by an American, Gordon Chang, whose, again, title speaks for itself, The Coming Collapse of China. When we meet him, we ask him, Gordon, is it this year or next year? When is it coming? It's never quite there. Roderick McFarquhar of Harvard, eminent historian, depicts China as sitting on a Sant Andreas fault, which is going to open up sometime. And a lot of short-selling hedge fund managers constantly predict that China is, in the words of one, on a treadmill to hell because of its financial and property system, and that everything is going to fall to bits. And we're in one of those phases at the moment, as you may have read from the financial pages of newspapers, where the whole question of liquidity, of what's called shadow banking in China, is reaching a crunch point, undoubtedly, and will cause considerable headlines over the coming weeks and months. But having said all that, and accepting both the strengths of China's rise and the question marks that hang over it, which I'll be talking about a lot tonight to explain why I don't think China is going to rule the world, I think that both camps are wrong. When I used to work for The Economist, we had this clever economist way of saying, well, people ask us, are we of the left or the right? Which is a bit strange to ask of The Economist. And our reply is always, we belong to the extreme centre. And that is slightly where I stand in China. I can see both sides, but I don't think China is going to collapse or implode because of its innate strengths, because it still has a lot of catching up to do, and for other reasons, which I'll come to in a minute. Nor do I think that it's going to rule the world, because I don't think any one country can rule the world. The formulation doesn't make sense these days, and I think the recent US global involvement would argue very strongly for that. And also because I don't think China wants to rule the world. As I'll explain later on, it is a much more domestically oriented leadership which we have in China today. These are the 7 men who rule China. The Standing Committee of the Politburo, the political bureau of the Chinese Communist Party, which was appointed, elected, selected, whatever verb you want to use, at the last party congress. These congresses are held every 5 years in November 2012. There's a 25-person Politburo, and the top 7 people on that constitute the Standing Committee, which is the supreme body in China. And always remember that China as a Leninist state is a place where the Communist Party is much more important than the government. And recent developments, which I'll mention in a few moments, have increased the power of the party. Everything in the end resides with the party. And the party's bottom line is to preserve its own monopoly power. When Deng Xiaoping launched economic reform in 1978, it wasn't that he woke up one morning and read an economics textbook and thought, oh, let's try a bit of this, it would be a good idea. He knew that China was in a terrible state after a very bad history dating back to the mid-19th century, exacerbated by the adventures and disasters of the Mao period, ending with the Cultural Revolution. And when he won the power struggle that followed Mao's death in 1976, Deng, as a patriot, he was a great Chinese patriot, but also as a lifelong communist. He joined the party as a teenager in France. Wanted to do two things. He wanted to make China a great power again, and he wanted to make the Communist Party the vehicle by which this power was achieved, because that would give it a specific legitimacy and a national legitimacy. And he went for economic growth as the way of doing that. And it was a brilliant kind of flash of light that he understood. He inherited a country which had abundant cheap labor, hundreds of millions of people in the countryside wanting to get into the manufacturing and the global labor force. Lot of cheap capital, because there'd be nothing to spend money on. So very high household savings in China. And the rest of the world was begging for cheap Chinese goods in order to keep down prices, a deflationary effect, which these prices had, and then eventually to recycle the earnings from these exports back into lending to Western economies, particularly the United States. If you wanted to, it's a bit sophistic, but if you wanted to, you could say that actually it was China which paid for the Iraq War by its funding of the federal deficit. So these 7 men have inherited that. The lead, and forgive me if I just go briefly through it for those of you who follow China closely, the man third from the left has got a rather strange expression on his face, you know, did I win the prize? He's Xi Jinping, who was appointed as General Secretary of the Communist Party, the top job at the Congress in November 2012, and at the same time became chairman of the Military Commission, which is another of the 3 top jobs in China, and then in March last year became state president of China. So he has the political power, the military power, and represents China in the world. The man beside him in the middle with the glasses, Li Keqiang, is prime minister and appears to be not exercising a great deal of power and authority at the moment, something that I'll come to in a second. The other people deal with different areas, with the economy, with Tibet and Xinjiang, and so on. And the man on the right, who's looking decidedly doleful in this, having just got one of the top jobs, Wang Qishan, who is probably the top economic expert in the Communist Party. He was moved because if he'd been vice premier in charge of the economy under Li Keqiang, he would have been much too strong and much too powerful. One could draw parallels with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in this respect. So he's been put in charge of the anti-corruption campaign, which Xi launched at the end of 2012. He's a very effective operator. The story is, and he's got a huge job, corruption being endemic in China. The latest official news that 180,000 officials were punished last year for corruption. You've, I'm sure, read about the case of Bo Xilai, which wasn't actually corruption. It was a power play question, but corruption was used to bring down Bo Xilai. At present, another member of the former standing committee, Zhu Yongkan, is also being pursued for corruption. Whether he'll actually be put on trial himself remains open. And the story going round, whether one believes it or not, about Wang Qishan is that at his first meeting, he is head of what's called the Disciplinary Commission, which is the Communist Party's own internal legal force, which operates outside the civilian law. It's a law unto itself. And at the first meeting of the Disciplinary Commission, it is said he had all his assistants sitting around the table, and a man came in with a trolley and gave everybody a dossier. And Wang said, will you please open your dossiers? And inside were lists of the assets held by all the people sitting around the table. In other words, to say, we've got you if we want to. I'm reminded of Thomas Cromwell in Bring Up the Bodies, who at one point says, yes, I've got the dirt on everybody. It's just a question of who I use it against. It's slightly in that situation. You'll also, to a moment of levity, you'll see that Wang Qishan is interesting, is different from the others for 2 other reasons. First of all, he's not wearing a red tie. He's got a blue tie. And secondly, he's allowed his hair to recede. All the others, Chinese leaders, all have wonderfully luxuriant heads of wonderfully black hair. I'm very jealous, as you can guess. There. So these are the 7 people who are in charge of China. Xi has, and I outline the politics here because I think this is, in a sense, at the the core of the question which I've already answered tonight. He's Party General Secretary, State President, Chair of the Military Commission, and then a Communist Party plenum, which took place last November, which set out a very ambitious programme of mainly economic reform, and also set up a National Security Council to coordinate both internal and external security. He is chair of both of those. So he has enormous power. He's probably the most powerful political figure in the world, has accumulated this power over the last 14 months in a way that most people really haven't quite noticed or taken fully into account. And how he coordinates all these is going to be one of the major stories, as I say, going forward for the next few years. He set out what he calls his China dream, which starts with strengthening the position of the Communist Party. He's using the anti-corruption campaign both to attack his enemies and also to try to make the party more popular, more acceptable to the Chinese people. There's an old saying in China, which actually dates from the Kuomintang days before the communists: if the party doesn't get rid of corruption, it will lose the trust of the people. If it does get rid of corruption, it won't have any members. And this is it's a nice question here, what happens. He's very keen on national unity. That means holding on to Tibet and Xinjiang, come what may. Great toughening of security in both those troublesome areas in the West. He and Li want to make the party state much more efficient, to make it much more like the kind of smooth-running machine which a lot of Western admirers think it is, but which in practice it's shown itself again and again not to do. He wants to improve the living standards of the Chinese people. Although China has got a lot richer, as I say, over the last 35 years on the whole, the poor have got less poor, but the rich have got richer even faster. And there is a definite social unhappiness with the extent of wealth disparities, particularly when they rely on corruption. Officials have been told to get closer to the people, to stop having banquets, to stop having motorcades, even now to stop smoking in public, which is quite amazing, not to take expensive gifts at Chinese New Year, as a result of which the top Chinese liquor manufacturers all are crashing down. Their sales are crashing down. I can only say I was at a state-owned enterprise in China last autumn, and the manager explained that he couldn't take us out to a banquet lunch, as he normally would have, because of this campaign, and we had to eat in the canteen. So fine, we went into the canteen. It was a private room with a 14-course banquet, but you do it behind closed doors rather than outside. Military modernization is very important. Xi has had good links with the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, since he was governor in an eastern province during the Taiwan Straits crisis of 1996. He's kept up, he's promoted younger generals and reorganized the military to be more effective, and the military budget is due to go up, it'll be announced next month, by about 10% there. And he wants China to play a bigger regional and global role. This is, if you like, what's put together as China's, as Xi's dream, and which leads some to think, well, that must mean that China is going to dominate the world. It will continue to rise inexorably as the West declines. Below this, you have, as I say, the Communist Party, which is an extremely minutely organised operation here, going from the Standing Committee through the Politburo, through the Central Committee, through the organisation department, which basically decides on who gets what jobs. And this goes all the way from the top down to village level cadres. It has what are called leading policy groups, quite apart from the Reform and National Security Commissions, which basically second guess and are superior to government ministries. Take an example, the Foreign Ministry. Right, you think the Foreign Ministry makes foreign policy in China. But the Foreign Minister is subservient to another member of the state council, the government, who is specifically there to look after foreign policy. And then in the Politburo, you have leading groups on foreign policy and on regional policy, plus now the National Security Council. In addition, the Ministry of Commerce and other ministries get involved in policy making, and of course the People's Liberation Army does too. So this all leads to, it's like there is a very complex organogram here of the party, but it often leads actually to second-guessing, to duplication, and to non-implementation of policies agreed at the top. That said, the party is extremely strong. 80 million members, plus some 75 million in its youth league, by far the biggest political movement in the world. Every organization and every company of any size has a Communist Party cell, which has veto power over policy decisions. The party school regularly indoctrinates cadres from all over the country. People will tell you, yes, but there are, quote, democratic parties in China. There are half a dozen of them, but they are very small. They play hardly any role. They occasionally have a non-sensitive ministry handed out to them. They are what are known derogatorily as flower pots, put there to charm the foreigners when they want to be told that China is more democratic than it appears. In the state, you have similarly a complicated series of responsibilities here, with theoretically the National People's Congress, the legislature, which is largely a rubber stamp operation, overseeing the whole thing, the Prime Minister overseeing the government, and all these people around him. But again, all subject to the ultimate decision back there at the top of the Communist Party. Now, that's the kind of, if you like, very quick guide to how China works at the top. It has delivered, of course, extraordinary economic growth, as I'm sure you're aware. Although that looks quite volatile, that graph, it never actually falls below 7%. That was at the end of 2008 when the international financial system was melting down. And you can see how quickly it recovered. And indeed, it recovered too quickly, and the policy in Beijing at the moment is to slow down growth, so you get more sustainable, better quality growth. The question is, having gone through this tremendous roller coaster of strong expansion since the 1980s, whether any administration, Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang at this point, can slow the thing down without the slowing down taking on a momentum of its own, which could be disastrous in terms of employment, happiness of the people, and thereby party rule. The rest of the world has played a very important part in this, as I say, through its buying of Chinese exports. You can see the greyish line there, which again have been falling off as demand in the West in particular has fallen off. But again, you can see how quickly those recovered after the fall at the end of 2008. But equally important are Chinese imports, because as I said, China is resources poor, so it needs to import enormous amounts of iron ore, of copper, of coal, of oil, probably now of natural gas, too, in order to keep its industrial and infrastructure machine going. This, of course, has had the global effect, particularly in Africa, Australia, and Latin America, on economies which now are largely proxies, Australia being a great example of this, for Chinese growth. So what happens to this graph in the future is of enormous, and to the overall growth numbers, is of enormous importance around the world. That rise has given the Chinese system great strengths, which have led to, as I said, the predictions of Chinese domination of the world. It's based on economic power, but it's also based on, I think, stability in China. this may seem contradictory because we no longer have, there used to be official figures in China on the number of public protests every year. It was running at around 120,000 and the government stopped publishing them about 3 or 4 years ago. It's now reckoned to be about 150 to 180,000 a year. These are on all kinds of issues. They're on bus fares going up, they're on police misbehaviour, they're on corruption, they're on official spending too much money, despite what Xi Jinping says. Above all, they are about land grabs, where local authorities grab land, which all belongs to the state, so they're legally entitled to do this, grab land from farmers at very low compensation rates, and then reclassify it as land for development, industrial, residential, commercial, and auction it off to developers at a very high price. And that's how local governments in China finance themselves largely. So you have all these protests going on all the time, but in a national, they're all one issue, one place protests, although there have been a number recently on the environment, which do seem to be coming together to some extent. But there is overall, China is a stable country, despite these individual outbreaks of instability. And there is no glue, if you like, of instability, if that's not an oxymoron, to hold them together. And I think from talking to Chinese officials, the great fear, for instance, is if growth slowed down and unemployment rose on a national basis. Officially, it's 4.2%. In fact, it's probably around 7% or so unemployment in China. But if it grew into double figures, then you could have the seedbed for broader instability in China. But for the moment, there is a stability, and it particularly contrasts that and national unity with the very sorry history of China since the 1830s. The official narrative, of course, is that this was all the fault of the foreigners led by the British during the Opium War. Well, yes, that is true to an extent, and I'm not excusing imperialism in China from the 1830s onwards. But far more important were the internal woes of China, huge revolts in the middle of the 19th century, which are hardly ever written about outside China, which lasted 4 major revolts, which lasted between them for about 25 years, probably about 20 to 30 million people killed. The Qing dynasty, the last dynasty, weakened very seriously. Then defeat by the Japanese, who were the most aggressive, of course, imperialists in China. Then the Boxer incident, where the dynasty miscalculated horribly. Then the revolution of 1911 to 12, which overthrew the imperial system, followed by warlordism until Chiang Kai-shek took the nationalists to power in 1927. Chiang managed to survive until 1949, despite the Japanese invasion from 1937, the beginning of the Second World War in Asia. But he was always a weak leader who only really ruled a small amount of China. Then you have Mao, you have the rectification campaigns, the anti-landlord campaigns, the anti-rightist campaigns of the 1950s. You have the Great Leap Forward, launched at the end of the 50s, which rather touchingly now, the original aim was that Chinese steel production should overtake Britain's steel production within 30 years. This shows how things have changed, which was a disaster, followed by the Great Famine, in which, according to the latest calculations, 40 to 45 million people died within a couple of years, followed by the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. So that is a pretty long story of huge tribulation of a nation. And compared with that, today's China must appear stable and united, even if a military force is used to retain Tibet and Xinjiang against protesters there. And finally, there is the strength of the lack of opposition. The Communist Party has made quite sure that there is no opposition. As I say, it's everywhere. It has cells everywhere. There's a saying quoted by Richard McGregor, who's written the best book about the Communist Party, called simply The Party. Somebody said to Richard, "The party is like God. It's everywhere. You just can't see it." And it has made sure that it permeates the whole of society, and there is really no alternative from that point of view, a lack of opposition, which, of course, if things went desperately wrong, would be a very dangerous state of affairs, since there's no one to take over within the existing system. But there are, at the same time, these major weaknesses, and this is really where I come to in my argument that China will not dominate this century. It's the imbalances and inequalities which have grown out of growth. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Gini coefficient, measuring inequalities. China again stopped publishing that about 5-6 years ago when it got into what is normally seen as socially dangerous territory. They brought it out again last year. The figure seems to be considerably underestimated. It's probably, officially it's 4.5, I think. Probably Chinese academics have worked out it's probably actually around 6. So that's far higher than in the West, almost as big as in Brazil. There's the concern about the quality of life, particularly among the urban middle class, who are very important in China. Because I remember when I was in Hong Kong, Bill Clinton coming through town on his way back from China and saying, we have to encourage Chinese economic growth because that will create a middle class which will create democracy as it did in Europe and North America. Well, he was completely wrong. What has happened is it's created a middle class, but that middle class has been very status quo so far, because materially they have done extremely well. It's probably 100 million, 120 million, depending on how you calculate it. And I mean, frankly, without being over cynical, if I was a middle-class family member in Shanghai with a nice flat, a company car, probably a second car, private education for my children, private health care, 2 holidays abroad a year, I don't want 700 million peasants to get the vote. You know, I would be quite status quo myself. The problem now is that the second generation of the urban middle class have almost got used to this material well-being. Of course, they want to be richer, everybody does, almost everybody. But they are now concerned about the quality of life, about air pollution, about water pollution, about food safety, about the fact, what I call the why questions. Why do I have to take a face mask with me to work in the morning? Why do I have to boil the water before I can drink it? Why can't I feed my baby Chinese baby formula because several 100,000 babies were poisoned, not killed, but poisoned by milk formula with poisoned milk in it, polluted milk in it. It's these concerns about the quality of life. And interestingly, it leaked out that at the time of the party congress in 2012, Wang Qishan circulated a suggested reading list to the other members of the Politburo. And prominent among this was Alexis de Tocqueville on the reasons for the fall of the Bourbon monarchy. And de Tocqueville says, I'm sorry, I haven't got the exact quote in mind, 2 things. First of all, it's reforms which were badly implemented and not carried through. Okay, be careful about reform. Secondly, the most dangerous moment for an autocracy is when the middle class has earned enough money to have time to think. And that's what's happening in China today. And that is a major, how you deal with that is a major, major issue for the kind of control system which the Communist Party represents. Agriculture is the kind of looming Achilles heel, if I can use a cliche like that, for China. All land belongs to the state. Farmland, it is divided up into tiny plots, which are then allocated to every rural household. So the theory is everybody has subsistence farming if they need it. The effect of that has been that China lacks big-scale farming and efficient farming. It's the whole farm machinery sector, the whole farm logistics sector, the seeds, everything is very backward. China has had 9 good harvests in a year. If it gets a bad one, it's going to be in trouble because it tries to maintain a 95% grain self-sufficiency policy, except for soy, which is given up on. It will have to either give that up or and go out and buy a lot of food in the outside global markets, or it'll have to start telling the middle class, sorry, you can't have sliced bread, you can't eat yogurts anymore, which is quite a difficult thing to push through. There's a lack of innovation in China. Chinese take out an enormous number of patents every year, but they are what are called application patents. They're not actually invention patents. And China lacks innovation. It lacks big global companies at the cutting edge of technologies. It has huge companies which are in technology, Alibaba being a well-known example, Tencent is another, but they've basically adapted Western approaches and applied them to China. I think the figure is that mainland Chinese who get PhDs, mainly in California, of them 90% are still in California 10 years later. So the kind of brain drain back to China, which was expected, has not really happened. And then, as I said, Tibet and Xinjiang remain a core element. China is not going to give up either of these, but Xinjiang, I think 24 people have been killed in clashes this year in Tibet, Tibet and Greater Tibet, outside Tibet, inside China proper. More than 100 Buddhist monks and nuns have burnt themselves to death since 2009, attracting very, very little international attention, it must be said. But Xi Jinping has certainly taken a very hard line over this. But that is a kind of bubbling weakness, I think, for China. Then we come to the whole question of China in the world. China, as I said, is resource dependent. It depends on the sea lanes being open to bring it all the things which it needs to continue to fuel its growth, even if that growth is going to be at a lower level than in recent years. Chinese officials will sometimes say to you, we have to build up a blue water navy, because imagine what would happen if terrorists exploded an atom bomb in the Malacca Straits, which is where most of the imports and exports come through. They don't mean that at all. What they mean is, imagine what would happen if the American fleet blockaded the Malacca Straits. We need to have a riposte to that. The fact that America has a very modern, very powerful naval force and air force based in Okinawa, in Japan, with which, of course, China is at loggerheads at the moment. And then you have what's called the island chain, which goes from Okinawa through Taiwan down to the Philippines. This, and it's understandable, is seen by China as hemming it in. It's a kind of containment there by a stronger military force. Hence, you get, at the moment, impending clashes between China and the United States, involving Japan, Vietnam, and the Philippines, with whom China has disputes in the South China Sea, to the whole East China situation, the whole East Asia situation is, I think, more fragile, more fraught than it's often thought to be. And China's only ally in all this is North Korea, which is rather strange there. Its military spending is going up, as I say, by 10% a year, but its military is still way behind the United States, and it has to deal with this reality of American power in East Asia and the friction with its neighbors, where Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines are all treaty allies of the United States. I come here to another, a question on which one can take a qualitative judgment. But although China has become much more involved with the rest of the world and is, for instance, one of the largest, if not the largest, contributor of troops to UN peacekeeping missions, and, for instance, has naval ships off Somalia to fight off the pirates there, China generally doesn't take what the last Roskill lecturer, Bob Zillick, described as a global stakeholder role. It complains, understandably, China, that it is living and playing in a world where the rules were made by other people, particularly by the United States, after 1945. But it doesn't come up with alternatives. Itself. It says that international political institutions should be reformed. But when there's talk of reform at the United Nations, where it has a permanent seat on the Security Council, it doesn't want to hear about it, because that might mean giving Japan or India a seat, which China certainly doesn't want. In the international financial system, the IMF, there was one talk about, at one moment, the governor of the central bank talked about using SDRs to replace the dollar, but he was promptly slapped down by his own senior officials in Beijing. The Chinese foreign policy is largely conducted on a bilateral basis, whether by aid, whether by trade agreements, or friction as in East Asia at the moment. But it isn't, there is no overall cohesive foreign policy, which I think a great power really does have to have, even if it can't and may not want to implement it a lot of the time. And then we come to the question of soft power, which again, different people can judge in different ways. But I think, broadly speaking, it's true that although China has spent a lot of money and made a lot of effort on soft power through newspapers published abroad, English language editions of newspapers, CCTV television, which has been on a huge expansion drive in the United States, cultural exhibitions, and so on, the actual impact of Chinese soft power, while it's made China more visible, certainly, still remains quite limited. And the belief that we are all going to become sinicized somehow, that we're all going to start learning Mandarin, and we're going to start living in a Chinese way, which has been put forward particularly by one book a few years ago, strikes me it just doesn't work, this. If you walk around not just Shanghai and Beijing, but smaller cities in China, you'll see far more signs of westernization, from clothes to McDonald's to the kind of entertainment that's there, than you will see of Chinese influences, say, in downtown Cambridge. It's there, certainly, China. We're more aware of it, quite rightly, but it is quite limited. And the China model, the Beijing consensus, the Beijing model, which was much touted a few years ago as being an alternative to Western democracy, again, has not taken off because people have come to realize that China is specific to itself. And to make perhaps a cheap point, but we see people demonstrating in the Middle East or in Ukraine for Western democracy. I've never seen people out in the street marching for the installation of a Chinese political model in their homeland. And this seems to me quite telling. And one could add, just on a personal note, that Xi Jinping, while holding up the dream of a rejuvenated, proud, confident China, sent his daughter to Harvard under a pseudonym. And I'm sure some of the leadership's children are probably at Cambridge at the moment. So, pulling this together to conclude, why China, I don't think, will dominate the century. Xi Jinping and his colleagues recognize that a degree of change, particularly in the economy, is needed. That they accept. But they think that they can do it within the confines of the party system. And my argument would be, which I develop in my new book and in my last book, is that actually, particularly with the middle class, particularly with the evolution of the modern economy, the two become incompatible in the end. At the party plenum in November, it was interesting, there was a sentence which said, "We will harness the power, the dynamic power of the market." And people jumped up and down and said, right, that's it, we're off to the races, new economy, and so on. 3 paragraphs later, but the state and party, which go together, the state will remain dominant. So the trick they're trying to do is to use other techniques, change, reform, market economics, to make the state more powerful in China. And I don't think that is going to prove possible long term. This is on the top of what I call the trust deficit, which arises from all the questions of food safety, of pollution, of everything else, of lack of accountability, a legal system in which judges all have to swear an oath of loyalty, not to the legal system, not to the country, but to the Communist Party, and a country, therefore, in which the saying only believes something when the government denies it, which is common in China. You might say it in a lot of places, but I think it has a particular resonance there. At the same time, the corruption reaches certainly deep, deep into society. There's an anecdote, perhaps telling there, that a reporter on a southern magazine in southern China a few years ago asked primary school children what they wanted to be when they grew up. And most of them said, oh, a sports star, a rock star, a big businessman, and so on and so on. And one little girl said, I want to be an official. And the reporter, when he wrote the story up, said, I thought this was wonderful. Somebody, a child who wants to serve the state. What kind of official, young girl? I want to be a corrupt official. Because they have all the nice things. And that is a story you hear. You've got the materialism which breeds, I think, a kind of a desire for instant gratification in China. There's a great deal, despite Xi's campaign for frugality, a lot of conspicuous consumption there, again summed up with a story which people were very familiar with all over China, a young lady on a television dating show in Jiangsu province who was asked, what are you going to be looking for in a young man on the show? And she said, well, I'll cut straight to the chase. I'd rather cry in the back of a BMW than laugh on the back of a bicycle. And that, a lot of people might say that, but that is very, very, the shuppies in Shanghai who make a point of spending every penny they've got by the end of each month and so on. This is quite a fragile, I think, society there. You have the clash, as I said, between reform and the status quo. If there's one name which the Chinese leadership react to with absolute horror, it's Mikhail Gorbachev, of course, because he is seen as the man who tried reform and allowed the system to be weakened, and nobody was there, as Xi Jinping has said, to stand up for the system when the test comes. And that leads us back to my starting point, in a sense. The regime, which is very powerful still in China, its end game, its paramount concern is to preserve its own position. And in doing that, it is, I think this is a very hazardous enterprise in the first place, but it means that regime will look inwardly. It'll look at all the kind of challenges which I've mentioned and others which I haven't got into, such as the demography, which is going to be a real major problem in China. And it becomes, in that sense, inward-looking, despite its presence and importance for the rest of the world. And that is why I reached my conclusion in the end that China is not going to dominate the century because nobody can, because it doesn't particularly want to, but because the scale of the challenges which have to be dealt with to maintain the regime at home are such and so enormous that they give Xi Jinping probably the biggest managerial job in the world, which is going to take him up full-time without thinking about extending China's rule across the globe. Thank you very much. I've talked too much.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much, but you're not off the hook quite yet because we have a little bit of time for questions, and I think we can run into the reception by 5 or 10 minutes as well, because I'm certain that there are going to be lots of questions. Jonathan's very kindly agreed to chair his own questions. We have 2 roving microphones in the room, Natalie and Liz at the back. If you've got a question, if you'd like to raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, and when the microphone comes to you, if you'd just like to introduce yourself for the record before asking your question, and if you can keep your questions or your statements and comments as brief as possible so that we can get through as much as possible in the limited time, that would be appreciated. But questions, please.
Former colleague, I recognise. Welcome.
Very good. Malcolm Dean, Roskill, son-in-law, Guardian journalist, under the distinguished deputy editor on the stage. Jonathan, 2 nights ago on BBC, Robert Peston was arguing that the problem for China was this massive debt, having been the banker of America in the 4 years, crunch years the West was undergoing, had this phenomenal investment. You know, every 30 days a new skyscraper, 30 new airports. He went on and on and on. How much do you give credibility to that, which he was saying that no country could spare those sort of debts?
Well, I won't go into details here. There was a paper drawn up by Morgan Stanley, Sharma at Morgan Stanley, which looked historically at countries which have had the level of debt that China has, and they all went bust. But frankly, with all respect, these were quite small countries which were often in a completely different situation from China, which is not dependent on foreign investment. I mean, that's the most important thing. Most countries which go bust due to debt, it's because the foreigners take their money out. Now, people aren't really doing that from China. It doesn't need that much foreign money anymore. It controls the currency, so it can stop outflows, except in suitcases to Macau, of course, which goes on all the time. But, Robert, I mean, he's quite right. There is a huge level of debt that has grown up in China because in, just brief history, 2008, when growth was falling and went below 7% in quarterly terms at the end of 2008, the government panicked in China. And they flung the equivalent of £2 trillion at a stimulus package, although only actually a quarter of it was ever spent on infrastructure, which was meant to, where the rest goes, went, nobody really knows. This created a huge credit boom in China, debt, and above all, it's debt, corporates to an extent, but above all, it's local authorities, which borrowed like there was no tomorrow, because that was what they were told to do, and built huge infrastructure projects which will never show a return. That tends to happen with it. The high-speed train being the greatest example of that. So that has produced a huge debt overhang in China. It's produced, when the government put the brakes on 2 years ago, people just went into what's called shadow banking, and these are all, some of them are subprime products, some are quite decent products, trust products, but it's led a whole undergrowth there on the financial sector, which they're trying to sort out at the moment. The trouble is that to sort it out, you'd have to let a few local governments go bust, which is actually against the law in China. They can't go bust by law. And you have to also allow a lot of these trust products some of them to go bust. Now, the point is that people are getting 10% return on their trust products compared with 3% from the banks, but they don't think there's a risk here because they buy them through the state banks and they think the state banks are guaranteeing them, which they actually aren't. And I've spoken to senior officials, 18 months ago, and they said, we ought to have a few defaults of these trust companies. And I said, a few? What do you mean? I mean, how many is a few, and how do you prevent a panic? And that's the problem. They've just bailed out another one 2 weeks ago because they're afraid of a panic on this. But it's absolutely right. There is a huge debt problem. Those will be rolled over. That's unhealthy. In debt, and it takes money away from private enterprise, particularly, which is starved of capital and therefore having to pay more. Yes, I mean, it's a huge financial problem there, but I don't think it's going to produce a massive crash for the simple reason I said, because in the end, the system will probably bail itself out, which is unhealthy, moral hazard and everything, but that's the way it works. Simple.
Daniel Zeichner from the Cambridge Labour Party. I'd like to ask about how the UK looks from China. I mean, Britain's politicians are fixated at the moment. We hear that George Osborne's daughter is learning Mandarin today, yes. And Liam Byrne for Labour is writing books about it. But given
I'm doing a session with him at the Cambridge Book Festival.
A plug. But given the visa regime and the immigration cap and all the rest of it, does this look like a welcoming place from China?
The UK, I think, sorry, I don't want to get into sensitive political matters here, but I think the present government certainly tends to overestimate our importance to China. You know, when David Cameron goes to China and says, we can be your best friend in Europe, we can make the EU work for you in China, well, given his European policy, probably not. And secondly, China's got a friend in Europe. When it wants something done in Europe, it doesn't ring Brussels, it rings Berlin. And we saw in various solar panel disputes and so on, Merkel gets the job done for the Chinese and so on. So there's a trading partnership. But then the whole question, you know, with the Dalai Lama, Cameron had met the Dalai Lama, so he was put on the naughty step for 18 months. It's usually 18 months. It varies between a year and 2 years there. And so, of course, when he went to China, are you going to mention the Dalai Lama? No, I'm not going to mention the Dalai Lama, which, you know, is a kind of kowtowing situation, maybe realism, but it's kowtowing. And then you look at the figures, and actually British exports to China increased during that 18 months of supposedly being in the freezer. So, you know, I think China they'll use you when they want to. It's very straightforward and realistic. They just bought into Peugeot in France, to use an example. They bought Dongfeng Motors just is in the process at the moment of buying into Peugeot, keeping Peugeot alive. Why are they doing that? Because Peugeot's got some technology which they want for the motor industry back in China. Why did they buy Saab and Volvo? Not for the Swedish unions, but to get the technology which is back in China. So when you're useful, yes, but don't overrate, the great power play, I don't think. I'm told by, this may be jaundiced diplomats, Western diplomats in Beijing, but they say this, America is the only country that matters. They want equality with America, they want to see off the Japanese, and the rest will play with them. Lady there. Sorry, I'll keep my replies shorter. There's a lady there, I think.
Sorry.
Whoever, I don't mind, put out your hand.
Tim Ingram, I'm an alumni from Churchill College. You didn't really cover demographics, but isn't there...
just at the end.
Isn't there a major problem
Yes.
there? The single-child family, for a long time, is now going to cause the combined problem of an ageing population with too few people to support it and too few people available to take jobs.
Yes. Sorry, I skated over it at the end. It's a limited time. No, you're absolutely right. It's not just a one-child policy, although that's what you're right about. Actually, fertility started falling in China around 1970 for a reason no one quite understands. And contraception came in. Then you had the one-child policy. And you have the sheer cost of having children in China because the health service is so poor. You have to do it privately. Kindergartens in Beijing have waiting lists of, hundreds of thousands and so on and so on. So you've got that. You've got the loss of what's called the demographic dividend, i.e. fewer workers coming into the workforce. At the same time, people are living longer and longer. Average life expectancy is around 71 years. And I think, come out of these... China always has these superlatives. You think, in 2020, China will have more people aged over 70 than the whole population of Spain. I don't know what that means quite, but supporting them will be a problem because of the demographic thing. Plus, you haven't got a pension system in China. There's a huge pensions black hole. There's a lack of care for the aged, etc. And the breakdown, not breakdown, but the weakening of the typical Confucian family, where you had family support, basically, for the old. The National People's Congress passed a law last March under which, if you're a parent or a grandparent, by law, you can require your children to visit you once a month. When you have to have a law for that, it doesn't say much about filial piety, I think. So this is a huge problem. Yeah. Yes. Let's go over this side.
Thank you. My name's Graham Perry. I was an undergraduate here in the early 60s, and my father was the first businessman to go to China in 53.
I know him, yes.
And I wanted to refer to a visit we arranged 4 years ago when, in response to a request from the Chinese, we brought Lord Chief Justice Wolf to Beijing. For one reason and one reason alone, the Chinese requested a lecture on the rule of law. And in the Great Hall of the People, he gave a very lengthy lecture on the rule of law in the UK. He didn't lecture on China, but all the questions coming from the Chinese audience were all on the conflict between the politicians and the judiciary. And I wanted people to understand that, because you rather blithely said all judges have to take an oath, as if to dismiss completely the idea of any judicial independence. I agree, coming out of an authoritarian state, the suggestion of independent judges rather it seems to be at odds. But what I observed in that visit, and I remember Christopher Hum was with me in the Great Hall of the People that day, was a surge of interest on the part of the Chinese, taking advantage of Lord Chief Justice Wolf's presence to pepper him with questions about something which has a far-sighted role and purpose in China. If I can just mention one other thing. The figure you put on for 150,000 disputes in China, it's got to be much, much bigger, because China has a tremendous amount of issues bubbling below the surface. And one of the reasons they wanted Wolf there was to try to understand how they could incorporate an independent judicial decision-making process to decide disputes. Now, I know you will say it's all about the party. There is another view.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
There is, indeed, and a lot of people have talked about legal reform. You're right, I'm not surprised by the questions. I've had discussions with them. But I think in the end, two things I'd say, which you won't agree with necessarily. First of all, I think in the end, it is a question of political power, and the law, this is not the law, necessarily the judges or the lawyers themselves, but the decision-making. I mean, Zhu Yongkan, the former standing committee member who's now under some problem, it seems, I mean, he is in charge of the legal system as a member of the standing committee of the Politburo. It's not the Chief Justice or anyone else. It's rooted in the party there. And also the other thing, just very briefly, is there is a long tradition, which I'm sure you're aware of, in China, of what's called legalism. We always talk about Confucianism, but actually legalism has always been a stronger government conduct, if you like, standard in China. And legalism basically says that you use the law as an instrument of state power to consolidate state power. And the first emperor who's always quoted, he wasn't a Confucian at all. He loved legalism, and he buried the Confucian scholars alive, or so it's said. We don't know. And that legalist tradition of using the law as a political instrument is still, I think, very ingrained in the politicians and at the top. But I take entirely what you say, that I think a lot of legal experts, scholars, judges, and prosecutors would very much like to open up and have the rule of law rather than the rule by law. The front in red.
Thank you. Fiona Cornish, I'm a fairly distant Roskill relation. I just wondered what you think the chances are of seeing a woman among the
this is always the question.
In the next few years.
I can't say. There are 2 women in the 25-strong Politburo. There's 1 woman in Vice Premier in China. Interestingly, where women have made quite an impact in China is in business. Several of the biggest companies, Soho, the big property company, for instance, G, the big appliance maker, which is run by a woman who says you must never smile because people think you're weak if you do. And so a fairly fearsome lady there. The lady who runs, Nine Dragons, biggest recycling outfit in the world. There are quite a lot of pretty strong and feisty women entrepreneurs in China, but as they say, I'm not holding my breath. Where should we go? Gentleman at the back, if we've still got Alan. Tell me when we must cut off. Last question.
Aaron Watts, Trinity College. Could I ask you to reflect on the phenomenon of rural-urban migration in China, principally how that relates to the state's capacity to control that? I asked you to reflect on that because I posed the question, how viable and in turn credible is the hukou household registration system in your estimation?
Well, the hukou, which is, for those who don't know, it ties you to your home place in China. If you go anywhere else in China, you're not entitled to healthcare, education for your children, you can't buy property, you can't start a business, you can't have a pension, which means that when you have 150, or how many it is, 150 million migrant workers at any one time in China, they are second-class citizens in the place they're working. My iPhone was put together, I'm sure, by somebody from Sichuan province who has no rights in Shenzhen, where Foxconn will have assembled it. That is recognised now, I think, as being unfair, but also as being an element of social instability there. And this is particularly second-generation migrant workers. Their parents, by and large, to put it crudely, were happy with the money, and that was all right. And they went back to the villages and opened little businesses there. Their children have lived as second-class citizens in places like Donghua and Shenzhen and other cities, and they don't want to go back to they've no desire to go back to the village and live on the farm. They want to start little businesses, etc., but they can't. And you've had a couple of very interesting, terrible words to use, riots in southern China, which are basically by migrant workers against the local inhabitants, who they see as being overprivileged. And so on. And we are going to get reform of that. It will start probably in 2 years' time. It's been tried a little bit in Chongqing, but under rather bad circumstances. And the problem with it is that local authorities in China, just very briefly, are short of money. If land rights to farmers, which I referred to earlier as being a cause, are now going to be guaranteed, as we're told, coming out of the party plenum, that removes a huge source of income for local governments. If on top of that, local governments have to provide welfare and services for tens of millions of migrant workers, their debt problem is going to be far worse there. It's going to be aggravated. So this all involves a recalibration of the financial and fiscal system to give them money-raising thing. But this is certainly something which is in the mind, and I think it's one of the first reforms which we'll see taking place, so long as it can be controlled. If you did it for Beijing and Shanghai, it would be disastrous. You've got to do it for smaller cities and control the whole process, and pump up the rural economy so people don't want to all go and work in the city.
Well, Jonathan, Thank you very much. The questions could clearly go on, and I hope they will go on over the reception. As the Master said at the beginning, you are all invited to join us for drinks in the Archive Centre. The Archives team will show you the way through the library to the Jock Colville Hall. Upstairs, in the reading rooms of the Archive Centre, above the hall, we have out a display of some of our treasures from our collections relating to China and to the subject of this talk. So we hope that you'll also make your way up there and have a look at that. The only rule is the usual one, which is don't take your drinks upstairs with you. Obviously, I want to thank you all for coming. For those of you who are staying to dine, and the dinner, appropriately enough, will be in our college canteen. For
14 courses.
Not quite. For those of you who are staying to dine, you can either leave your coats and bags in the cloakroom down here, or you can take them up to the dining hall and leave them on the racks just outside the dining hall. I also want to thank all of the college staff and the Archive Centre team for the enormous amount of work that goes into this lecture. But most of all, of course, I want to thank Jonathan. It seems to me that we've ranged across centuries, we've gone across all sorts of disciplines, we've gone through all of the isms, and I think what you've done in this hour is to give a magisterial overview of the colour, the complexities and the challenges that is modern China, and we thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Report back.